Hey, it's Alicia Kay. Another month has come to an end, which means it is time for my June wrap-up. Now, June was an interesting reading month because I actually rated some of the books I read on like a 5-star scale. I didn't rate all of them. It was something I was kind of testing out. And honestly, I'm not sure if I'm going to continue with it or not. I'm just kind of basing it on how I feel when I finish the book, on if I get it a rating or not. The rating system I use this month is called Cawpile, and this is not something I created. It is something I will have linked the information down in the description box. If you've been around BookTube a lot, you have probably already heard of it. And it is something I have used off and on, but mostly off ever since I heard about it a couple years ago, and I thought I'd kind of give it another try this month to see what I think. Like I said, I'm not sure if I'm going to keep implementing it going forward. I still have some decisions to make, but for this month, the books that I did rate, I will mention that rating, and for the books I didn't, I obviously will not just think of a rating off the top of my head right now. For the month of June, I did read 11 books, and I will go ahead and get into them in the order that I read them. The first book I read was Who is Vera Kelly by Rosalie Knecht. This is a book that follows a young woman, a 20-something-year-old woman who is like a spy for the CIA. I don't know exact phrasing. I don't remember exactly what they described her as. Maybe like an agent for like the FBI or the CIA, and is in Argentina at the time of like civil unrest, and there's about to be a coup, and it follows kind of like her story and the story of this civil unrest and this impending coup and everything that happens. And I liked this book. I will probably read the second one. I thought it was an interesting look into like characters, and also like I kind of brand myself as not liking historical fiction, but this 100% is historical fiction, and I really enjoyed it. And so it made me think that maybe I just don't like certain types of historical fiction. So I think maybe the historical fiction, whether or not I like it, depends on time period and place. And this is just one that I liked. I don't know. Maybe it's just the writing. The next book I read was The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. This is a book of vignettes that follows 4 mothers who immigrate from China and their daughters. Before I picked this up, I didn't actually know it was told in vignettes. I thought it was one long story, like most books are. That being said, like I wish I'd known that before, but that being said, I still enjoyed this book. I thought it was an interesting character study, really, and showed that you can write a very compelling, cohesive story in vignettes, even without like one overarching storyline. Next, I read The Dead and the Dark by Courtney Gould. This is a book that I had been hearing about a lot, like when it came out a couple years ago in 2021. And I finally decided to pick it up. This is like a horror mystery YA book that follows this girl whose dads are like these famous TV ghost inspectors. They're called like para inspectors or something like that. And they go back to the hometown that the dads are from. And it's this very small town in Oregon. And they're trying to figure out like the mystery of this town and why weird things are happening. I thought this was a pretty good book, and I enjoyed the Oregon setting. I grew up in Oregon. I don't live there anymore, but I always kind of I have a soft spot in my heart for books that take place in that state, even though this was not set in the city I grew up in. I also thought it was a very interesting look at like homophobia in small towns, and I know that's like not the central point of this book, but it's kind of what I was thinking about, especially as it was Pride Month. I thought the mystery was interesting, but not like super mysterious. It wasn't like the most difficult mystery to figure out. but there was a couple twists and turns that were kind of fun. Another thing I paint myself as is someone who doesn't like YA, but I still do read YA books occasionally and do enjoy them, and this was the case for The Dead in the Dark, where I did enjoy it, even though it was YA. It didn't fall into a lot of the things that I dislike about YA, which is like an obsession with talking about high school. This didn't talk too much about like the everyday things of going to high school, which is kind of what I dislike YA for. So I did enjoy this book, and honestly, I finished this book like towards the beginning of the month, and I don't even remember having too strong of feelings about it, besides just like, yeah, this is pretty good. Next, I read The Dim Sum of All Fears by Vivien Chien. This is the second book in a cozy mystery series I recently started that follows a young woman who works in her parents' noodle shop, and then this noodle shop is in like a strip mall, and it follows all of the mysterious events, all the murders that are happening in this strip mall. That's kind of the basic premise of the series. What I will say about this book is that it's a fairly standard cozy mystery. I've said multiple times on this channel that I don't necessarily expect cozy mystery books to have the best writing, and this was the first of 3 cozy mystery books that I read on this month in June, and all of them kind of fall into some of the same issues that I had with this one, and I think I maybe cozy mysteried myself out at this point. I think I need to take a break, because while I did enjoy this book, by the end of it I was just a little bit tired, because I was like, just have some common sense. And this was the case with like all of the cozy mysteries I read, that by the end of them I was just a little tired. So I did enjoy this book. At this point, I don't know if I'll continue on with the series, just because I have maybe cozy mysteried myself out and I need a break, and I don't know how long that break will last and what I read when I come back from that break. But for now, I'll be taking a little pause. Also, since this was the second book in the series, I do think the writing was a little bit better than the first book, but still, I found it a little bit lacking. Like I said, I don't necessarily turn to cozy mysteries for their phenomenal writing, but in getting tired of them, I was a little bit like, I wish the writing was a little bit better in all of them. Next, I read Enola Holmes, The Case of the Missing Marquess, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that word, by Nancy Springer. I read this book in Spanish as part of my continual plan to practice, and this was actually a pretty good level for me of being like in between. It's like kind of middle grade, kind of YA, and it was good for me to also learn some new words that would have been used kind of in this time period that we don't really use now, and I enjoyed the story. Because this is not the type of book I would normally read, this wasn't like 100% on my alley, and I don't know how much I would have enjoyed this story if I had read it in English, but because I read it in Spanish, I'm like a little bit more forgiving, since I am mostly doing it to try to practice my Spanish and try to brush up on it a little bit, because I'm much worse with Spanish than I used to be. And since that was the main goal of this, I think I maybe enjoyed the story more than I would have if I had read it in English. That being said, I thought the mystery was kind of interesting, but because of the age, it wasn't like super in-depth, and there wasn't really any surprising twists and turns, for me at least. Next, I read Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This is a recent release that everyone is talking about. This is the story of a woman who graduated from a prestigious writing program and then went on to publish a book that didn't end up doing very well. But her friend / nemesis from college also got published and ended up becoming a literary darling. Now, since they were kind of friends, one night they are spending time together, and Athena, who is the other woman, their names are Athena and June, and Athena is the one who got published and became the literary darling. She dies in a really absurd circumstance, and June steals the manuscript that Athena had been working on and publishes it under a racially ambiguous name. And this story follows everything that happens after that. I'm honestly not sure what to say about this story because I did enjoy it. Maybe I read it very quickly, and it is almost like compulsive to read. You are almost bound to keep reading it without stopping once you start it. And sometimes I actually have an issue with that because when it becomes almost like a compulsion, I feel like, oh, I don't actually want to be reading this book right now, but I feel like I have to. Like there's something else I want to do, but because I am bound to this book at this moment, I can't do that other thing I want to do. That happened to me a little bit with this book. I mean, like I said, I still enjoyed this book. This is a book where I'm not sure if the word enjoyed is actually the right word. Like I said, I finished it very quickly and I felt a lot of emotions. And I think that is the goal of R.F. Kuang in this book, is to make you feel a lot of emotions. And I think writing from June's perspective and being in her head the whole time is a tool to make you feel all of those emotions that R.F. Kuang wants you to feel. This book is largely about racism, and I'm not really gonna talk about the racism aspect of it. I will leave Own Voices reviewers down below, links if you want more discussion on that. I don't feel like I can really speak to that. This book was a really interesting look at bad people doing bad things and what happens in the online space when bad people do bad things, and what happens in the online space when bad people do bad things to other people who aren't necessarily the best people either, and how online discourse shapes literary industry and also just the world in general. This is one of the books I rated, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was The Deep by Rivers Solomon. This book is a pretty short book, and it follows these people who are like almost like mer people. They're called the Wajinru, and they are descendants of pregnant African slave women who were thrown overboard by slave owners. I really liked this book. I thought it was very immersive and atmospheric, and also it's like about remembering and forgetting and what should be remembered and what should be forgotten. And I thought it was very well done. Just like a very, very well done, pretty short piece of fiction that I really enjoyed. This is another book that I rated. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and also I think the cover is beautiful, and I don't know if that's why I was originally interested in this book, but this is one that had been on my list for a long time, and I'm glad I finally got around to it. The next book I read was The Golden Spoon by Jessa Maxwell. This book is pitched as like Great British Bake Off meets a murder mystery. And I was sold from the first time I heard about it. I was like, this book sounds so good. I love the Great British Bake Off, and I think murder mysteries can be fun to read. This book follows as 6 contestants go for a week of a baking show that's out in the countryside in the northeast of the United States, and a different baker is eliminated every day. And at the beginning of the book, you are like POV someone finding a dead body, but you don't know who the dead body is. And then you kind of like jump back to starting the week of baking. This is a book that I enjoyed, but maybe not as much as I expected it to. This is another book I rated, though, and I did rate it pretty high, which is kind of a separate conversation about if I think rating systems are inherently broken, which I haven't even answered within myself. But I don't love giving a rating just based off of gut feeling, because it feels so subjective. But then also when I put it into this compile system that I use, sometimes it will spit out numbers that I'm like, that doesn't actually necessarily reflect what I feel like this book should be. So I haven't really found a happy medium yet. That is beside the point. The point is, I enjoyed this book a decent amount. There were a couple things I had issues with, like the motivations of one of the characters felt a little off to me, and I think needed a little bit more backstory a little bit earlier in the book. But other than that, I thought it was pretty well done and I enjoyed it. So I ended up giving this book 4.5 stars. But now that I'm separated from it, like, I don't honestly know if I look back and think, yeah, that's a 4.5 star read, or if it's a 4-star read. And that is why I don't normally rate books, because I don't necessarily trust rating systems very well. But right after I read it, I put it in as 4.5 stars. So take that for what it's worth. So 2 things just happened. One, I realized my TV was on, so I'm sorry if you saw like bursts every once in a while in the background. And 2, I realized there was a book I forgot, because it did not get into my reading tracking software. I simply neglected to enter it. I think it was the next book I read. I can't remember if I read this one next or the one that I will talk about after. But I'll talk about this one now. It is The Ghost Brigades by John Scalzi. This is the second book in the Old Man's War series. This is a sci-fi book. This is a sci-fi series. And as this is the second book, I don't know how much I can say about it. Old Man's War follows old man. He's like in his 70s, who signs up to join the army. Join the military that exists in this like future timeline. And his story and what happens, and explains why they're recruiting old people and all that good stuff. This is the second book in the series. It was not as good as the first one. A couple issues really stuck out with me. The first one being that this one uses the R word, and that was just like a shock to the system. This was published in 2006, so probably would not have been a shock to the system at the time that it was published, but reading it in 2023, I was shocked. So definitely know that before you pick up this book. The other thing is, like, trigger warning, content warning for some child death. It's not necessarily super descriptive. I would say it's like a moderate to light level of descriptiveness, but did cause an issue for me. And that's actually one of the things I ended up disliking about this book. I think this book is trying to have a conversation about war and the bad things that happen in war, but I don't know if it did it 100% successfully. That being said, I still enjoyed this book, and I will continue on with the series, but it's not as good as the first one, and I don't know if it pulls off the conversation it's trying to have 100%. Without giving too much away, I did enjoy some of the things it said in that conversation, especially regarding like choice and free will. This is another book I rated, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next, although I think I actually did technically finish it before I finished The Ghost Brigades, but that doesn't matter, is Caught Red-Handed by Ellie Alexander. This is the 4th book in a cozy mystery series I've been reading recently, and I think it's the weakest in the series. It follows this woman who runs a bake shop in Ashland, Oregon, again with the Oregon setting, and, you know, follows her as she tries to solve mysteries, deaths that are happening around Ashland. This book is the weakest in the series. It includes, number one, a character I really disliked, and then also the writing just wasn't that good. It hasn't really bothered me up until this point with these books, but there were some moments that I just had to stop and like take a deep breath and say, I don't come to these books for the writing, because it was kind of bad, like really bad. There was a couple moments where the dialogue got really extra cheesy and characters were repeating the same line like 3 or 4 times in a row. And I understand that people can do that, but in a book it feels like poorly written. And then there was this description of the character I don't like that was... It was rough. It was rough. So I'm not sure about my future with this series. But as I mentioned before, I need to take a break from cozy mysteries. I really, really do. And I still have one more to talk about in this wrap up. So, yeah. I really need to take a break, you guys. Also, I rated this book. I gave it 3.5 stars out of 5. Next, I read How the Penguin Saved Veronica by Hazel Pryor. This is a book about this kind of crotchety old woman who doesn't think she has any living relatives, and in an effort to get her estate in order, she like finds that she has a grandson, and then becomes obsessed with penguins. This book is interesting. The main character in this book is insufferable. And I love insufferable old people, like, in person. I want to try to befriend them and make them like me sometimes. But I kind of just did not like this character. And I had the same problem when I read a man called Uwe. Uwe? I don't remember how to pronounce it anymore. I also read this book, and I should mention that also for the last book I talked about, Caught Red-Handed, and The Ghost Brigades, I was sick when I was reading all of those books. I got sick for a week and a half. And for a good week of that, I could not do anything. And I feel like I read a lot. I mean, looking at the number count of books I read, it's not that much higher than what I have been reading recent months. But the other thing I've been doing this month that I'm not really going to talk about in depth is I have been reading a lot of short fiction and short stories that I have been getting through publisher newsletters and things like that. And it's not necessarily things I'm tracking, but I did have a lot of reading this month that was not tracked because it was a short story that came from a publisher's newsletter. Hi, buddy. Breldon also had a really good reading month, but he did have to have surgery to get his teeth removed, so he did not love that. Ignore him or enjoy the cat. I'm not going to move him. I did give How the Penguin Saved Veronica 3.5 out of 5 stars. The last book that I read in June was Against the Current by Olivia Matthews. This is also the third cozy mystery book that I read, and this is about a 20-something-year-old woman who is opening a bakery with her family, and this has been her dream since she was a child. And on the day of their soft launch, one of the neighborhood bullies essentially comes in and threatens her, and then she ends up kind of threatening him back, and then the next day he is found dead and she becomes suspect number 1 in his murder. This book was, I think, the best written out of the 3 cozy mysteries I read this month, but that can't save it from the fact that I was just so worn out by the time I read this book of cozy mysteries, And even though it was the best written, there were still moments that I was like, I'm just kind of over the thought process that goes into cozy mysteries and the complete disregard for common sense that seems to occur in all cozy mysteries that I've ever read. Like, this is not an exception to the rule. None of them are like, this had less common sense than the other ones. They all kind of fall into this trope. And I think by the time I read this, I did this book a great disservice by already being kind of cozy mysteried out. But it came in. I like had it on hold from the library and it came in. So I read it. And I enjoyed it. Of the books I read, of the cozy mystery books I read, I think this is the best one. And it's the one that I will like be most likely to continue on with the series once I'm done with my cozy mystery break. That is everything I read in June. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you read in June down in the comments, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!